in the Iranian hostage crisis. It was literal treason. So it's kind of funny when and it's not the first time this happened, okay? It's not the first time. Trump is not the first time this has happened either. Trump is just basically doing the old school method that Republicans have done, that Henry Kissinger also did. Nixon did it too. So it's not like a new concept at all. Republicans have done this forever. Yeah, I did say that. That was funny. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy Carter is dead at the age of 100, okay? At the age of 100, Jimmy Carter died. Now, obviously, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, and I will continue talking about this today as well, because there's a lot of fresh eyes on this, new people who are unfamiliar. Now, the first question on everyone's mind probably is, oh my God, how could he have died so young? Right? The second question on everyone's minds is probably, was he vaccinated? Or did the CIA get to him, you know? Because obviously, when you're so young and virile and clearly, you know, have at least another 20 to 30 years ahead of you, when you have so much life to live still, it is kind of shocking, if not alarming. When someone in their prime dies like this, it's probably a vaccine death. Okay? It's probably a vaccine death. Some people have said maybe Mossad because of his opinions on Israel. You know, I don't know. I don't know what ended up happening. I will not be making an assertion. That New York Times 30 timestamp is to remember there's some TOS. Yeah, no, I see that. I understand that. What was the public perception of Jimmy Carter? Good, right? Fuck no. Jimmy Carter's public perception now is like relatively positive because of all of the amazing things that he did after his presidency. But when he left office, he was one of the most historically unpopular presidents. He was literally, I mean, people despised him. Republicans basically, first of all, he led to Ronald Reagan, okay? Ronald Reagan, the Satan incarnate, putting up LeBron numbers all around the country. And also on top of that, every American had like this, like they considered him to be a squishy lib. They hated him. Like, there was so much resentment against him, and we'll talk about why. But yeah, Trump's lines at his rally was literally, Biden is the worst president since Carter. Like, Republicans have kept up this like anger and resentment and hatred that towards Jimmy Carter's presidency has been whitewashed due to the incredible humanitarian that he was. Dude was so bad that he turned my Democrat grandfather into a fascist-adjacent Trump supporter. There's a literal line that could be drawn from Carter admin to 9/11. That's why I always say Jimmy Carter did 9/11. I say that as well. Jimmy Carter's administration is almost as responsible for 9/11 as the Reagan administration was. Almost as responsible for 9/11 as it was the inception. A lot of people think Operation Cyclone is where the Mujahideen started getting armed and trained openly by the CIA and the American government. It actually didn't start with Ronald Reagan. It started with Jimmy Carter. Okay? That's what a lot of people don't know. Jimmy Carter's own National Security Council, Zbigniew Brzezinski, very famously in an interview to a French magazine, openly admitted that they were radicalizing militants, some of which became the Taliban, as you guys know, some of which became Al-Qaeda, radicalizing militants, arming them in an effort to force the hand of the USSR to invade Afghanistan and turn Afghanistan into, in his words, the USSR's own version of Vietnam. Carter also kick-started the shift towards neoliberalism, both from the Democratic Party. Obviously, Ronald Reagan supercharged it and made it permanent. But Carter was the original inception point. Now, we'll talk about that sort of stuff in a brief moment. But before we get to that, so on the domestic front, he did a bunch of anti-union shit. Okay. And then Ronald Reagan basically overtook that and dominated that field entirely. So Carter, I think, is seen as like a shitty president across the board by many Americans, but for bad reasons, when he should be seen as a shitty president because all presidents are shitty, even though in his post-presidential life, he did a whole bit of good, okay? He worked on foreign policy. He has one of the Carter Institute is one of the very few unique center-left foreign policy think tanks out there, I would say, okay? Like, it's shocking. Carter also wrote books about, Israel being an apartheid state and very actively talked about how Israel is an apartheid state. So there is a lot of stuff that he did when he was president that was dog shit as you're sitting on that throne. And then a good deal of good that he did in his personal life. So I think he's a unique figure in that regard because it's you can be a good person overall, like truly a good person, but also simultaneously be like a evil guy when you are the president. It's virtually impossible for you not to be evil for the most part when you are the president of America leading the empire. So, it's an interesting figure for that reason. That's why I didn't play the, that's why I didn't play the crab rave meme for Jimmy Carter when he died. Normally I would. He is one of the few presidents, I think, that definitely tried to atone for his sins, I would say, even though, you can't do that. All right. But let's hear how the media covers him, and then we'll continue to talk about it.
The parade has started. He's out of the car.
This was not planned. It was not scheduled. By golly, Bob, how about that?
It was nearly 50 years ago that the newly elected Jimmy Carter broke with convention and walked to the White House, signaling a new era of openness after the painful Watergate scandal that
Yeah, this is also funny. Like, he came in after Nixon, okay? This is the lowest point in the eyes of many Americans for the Republican Party, where you got Richard Nixon doing like insane incompetence, demonstrating incredible incompetence. And people hated it. Like, people hated by the end of the Nixon term and the Gerald Ford tenure and pardon. Americans were like, "Fuck the Republican Party." Okay. And so he rode on that. He rode on that momentum, but he was not able to capitalize on the moment.
toppled Richard Nixon.
I'm a Southerner, and I'm proud of a heritage that shows concern for the working men and women.
The born-again peanut farmer from Georgia was a political outsider whose folksy charm paid dividends at the ballot box.
Governor Carter from Georgia, running for president. I want to ask you to help me next year.
First as governor of his home
There
state,
is no...
and then winning the Democratic nomination for president in 1976.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
Hello, everybody.
Everybody knows you're gay
Once
now.
he got to Washington, though, his outsider status played against him. Unable to persuade...
Yeah, he's a Navy officer, only fucking American president to actually have a submarine certification, took over his family's peanut farm, ran for governor of Georgia, Southern country bumpkin, unique at the time, especially for like the Democrats, I would say. I mean, I guess like since then as well. He's a good old Southern boy, right? What's up, you big black money? I like that you had to correct yourself. You were like, no, I didn't mean money. I meant you're a big black monkey. That's cool. That's cool, man. Old school racism. That's like weird, really weird behavior. Peanut farm owner sounds like a joke job. It's not. First Southerners is 1837. Yeah, I like that he corrected himself. He didn't want me to misunderstand that he was being racist. So thank you for being thank you for correcting yourself, just so we understand.
Made a bare-knuckle Congress to approve his plans for consumer protection, labor reform and healthcare. Instead, it was the international stage that provided him the platform for his greatest political achievement. In September 1978, Jimmy Carter invited the leaders of Israel and Egypt to his...
This is always so funny because the way they fucking glaze Jimmy Carter for his foreign policy accomplishments is hilarious because, like, even from the domestic attitude at the time, obviously the Iran hostage crisis is, like, part of the reason why he is despised. Like, that's one of the major reasons why he's despised. Obviously, the economy is a significant factor here, inflation. But also, like, this wasn't necessarily all that good of a deal for at least the Palestinians. And also, there's a shit ton that the Carter administration did in terms of advancing American empire and its interests, in terms of accelerating and destabilizing areas during the Cold War. Like, he continued all that. It's not like he was a dove. I think his post-presidential work is significantly more dovish than what he did when he was in charge.
His presidential retreat at Camp David. It was an extraordinary 13 days.
I'm gonna leave for now. Maybe I'm a lib, but given the context of the 70s, Jimmy Carter's presidency is grossly misinterpreted. Also, tired of the Afghan Mujahideen and 9/11 pipeline talking point. It rids the Afghans of all agency and legitimate gripes they have with the USSR in Afghanistan. The USSR were backing a government for the funsies, just like they didn't back Bashar Assad for the funsies, etc. Anyways, it is what it is. I think it's pretty funny that you're... I don't know if you're like a Jimmy Carter fan and that's why you're saying this, but it's wild. Like, it's wild to use CIA adjacent talking points in 2024. That's wild, chatter. As you know, and I have covered this extensively, the Afghan government at the time was ruthless to a lot of the Muslim villagers. Okay? That's true. I never said that that's not true. Having said that, the CIA actively utilized the real resentment that some people had and radicalized people, only giving further credence to this already militant government to continue using this as an opportunity to just fucking murk as many people as possible, saying, well, we got to deal with these guys. They're fucking crazy. You're talking about the Soviet-backed Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, just for context, right? Some chatters may be confused. Yes. And it's not like the Afghan government was also favored by the USSR either. They were like, dude, you're going crazy. Dial it back. To their own fucking USSR aligned government. But it's crazy to say that this involvement was like America's involvement, which has been openly talked about at this point in 2024, makes it seem as though like it's insignificant, inconsequential. Did Lola leave already? There was a near collision at LAX. Wait, what? This is par for the course in virtually every story of American involvement. American involvement doesn't just happen out of nowhere, okay? American involvement doesn't just happen out of nowhere. There is always a righteous cause that they align themselves with. It's how much credence you give to that narrative. If you ever turn around and say, no, the overwhelming majority of people wanted this, yeah, no, you're serving the purpose of the State Department at that point. It's very frustrating. We all did the homework and listened to Blowback season 4 last year. Good. I'm re-listening to Blowback season 3 right now. It's such a banger on Korea. It's so fucking good. All right.
Days that followed, President Carter used perseverance, negotiation, and sheer will to forge an agreement no one before had imagined possible, let alone achieved, a peace deal between the Arabs and Israel.
To these two friends of mine, the words of Jesus, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be the children of God."
But at home, with an economy in the doldrums, he couldn't find peace with the American people.
Gasoline shortages are spreading across the country. Closed gas stations are becoming increasingly common.
Spiraling oil prices brought petrol shortages across the country. But his decision to point the finger at voters would cost him dear, as they, in turn, asked why their president was blaming them and their consumer culture for the nation's woe.
I forget who I read this. I think it might have been Noah Colwyn who posted about this, but apparently Yasser Arafat tried to warn Carter about, we all know at this point that Ronald Reagan manufactured the hostage crisis or extended it to benefit his chances, right? To basically ridicule the Democratic Party, to basically ridicule Carter, make him look like a fucking squishy lib who wasn't up to the task of saving the lives of these Americans that were trapped, right, in the Iranian hostage crisis. It was literal treason. So it's kind of funny and it's not the first time this happened, okay? It's not the first time. Trump is not the first time this has happened either. Trump is just basically doing the old school method that Republicans have done, that Henry Kissinger also did. Nixon did it too. So it's not like a new concept at all. Republicans have done this forever, okay? And the Democrats keep going, I don't know how this could have happened. Like, what? It's the third time. Trump did it as the third time, okay? Like, cutting a side deal with a foreign adversary or a foreign ally in an effort to harm the electoral chances of the existing Democratic Party's administration is a old trick that the Republican Party has done now 3 fucking times. And it's at least somewhat instructive for you to understand, especially if you watched it happen. You watched the Democratic Party not do a single damn thing against this. Against Trump openly just being like, yep, I'm talking to Netanyahu. I'm going to make him do the ceasefire when I'm president. What did the Democrats do? They just fucking threw their hands up and went, oh, I don't know. We're not even interested remotely in dealing with this. So just so you understand, like, it was the same exact incompetence even back then, maybe even supercharged.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption.
But the ultimate blow for his presidency came from an event that haunts America still.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner.
After President Carter decided to allow the ousted Shah of Iran to the US for medical treatment, militant students of the Islamic Revolution stormed the US embassy in Tehran, and 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. The crisis then compounded when Jimmy Carter ordered a rescue mission that ended in disaster, a crash in the desert that left 8 US commandos dead. Carter persevered, eventually brokering a deal with Iran to release the hostages, but by then it was too late. Voters had turned against Jimmy Carter for his perceived weakness, and Ronald Reagan, a Republican, was elected in a landslide victory.
Is there any word about the hostages? Have they taken off? Any word from the hostages?
I could have destroyed Tehran with one military strike. But had I done so, I don't have any doubt that every hostage would have been assassinated. So I had to be patient for 14 months, I think with the appearance in some people's minds of weakness, but eventually my prayers were answered and every hostage came home free and safe.
It was Carter's work post-presidency, though, from building homes for the poor to his advocacy of human rights, that undoubtedly has earned him the highest accolades.
Any problem at all?
Do you think the media was the main cause of everyone's turn against Carter? No, because I mean, the media definitely played a role in this. The media has always played a role in this. But I think it was also his own personal incompetence. It's like saying, do you think that it's the media's fault that people turned against Joe Biden? No. The media plays a role for sure, but a good leader is supposed to overcome these things, okay? A competent leader is supposed to overcome these things. Now, there are a lot of dark aspects to his legacy as well that no one covers, because that's just American foreign policy machine operating at the behest of empire, and it leads to many different atrocities. From South Korea to East Timor, there are plenty of awful things that the Carter administration did, including, like I said, the origination of Operation Cyclone, right? So we'll get to all of that. We'll get to all of that. But just understand that he is a good dude who did a whole bunch of bad shit and overall was relatively incompetent. He definitely did a lot of good stuff after his presidency. That much is clear, okay? Fuck Jimmy Carter and his administration supported the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan war, with Pakistan's establishment deeply involved. While it countered Soviet influence, it also gave rise to militant groups like Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Pakistan has lost around 90,000 lives fighting terrorism stemming from this policy, leaving the nation burdened with decades of instability and violence. What is this? Kurt Cobain on Jimmy Carter? What's good? Alex is leaving. Okay, dude. What do you want me to do? I'm working right now. Here, I'll give you a hug. Bye, chat. All right. Bye. Place. And just like that, the Alexander Lull overruled reign is over. He's done. He can't hurt you any longer. Kiss him on the lips? Yeah, okay. Ryan Grimm's summary of Carter was on point. Carter was a terrible president and a wonderful ex-president. I'd prefer the other way around, but RIP. It's true. That's a great way to summarize it. That is a great way to summarize this.
That is a wonderful story.
When Jimmy Carter was interviewed by Channel 4's Jon Snow, he'd been out of office only 4 years, but had begun.
Is the Russo-Ukraine war the first time post-World War II that American military support is morally justifiable? Of course, this is the wake of the Obama's fumble of Crimea seizure and separatist agitation. No, the only reason why it's considered morally justifiable is because of Russia's overarching violent and completely unjustifiable military action. Any matter of foreign conflict could be solved through diplomacy, and many other parties have tried to solve this through diplomacy. And Russia's unwillingness, but also Western agitation and specifically American agitation, certainly played a role in this as well. America is morally on the right side in terms of Ukrainian emancipation, but for the wrong reasons. Oh my God, that shot of the World Trade Center after Carter helped fund the people who take them down to cinema. Oh, Jesus. Wait, let me play this again.
When Jimmy Carter was interviewed by Channel 4's Jon Snow, he'd been out of office only 4 years, but had begun arguably the most productive period of his public life.
So we're building about 1 house per day for people who don't have homes without interest. The Bible says you shan't charge interest to people who are poor. So we believe in biblical economics.
The deeply religious Christian reborn this time as social reformer and humanitarian who dedicated himself to helping the disadvantaged. It was that mission, as well as his ongoing efforts to find solutions to international conflicts, that earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002.
Mr. Carter, can we have some questions, please?
But Carter failed to broker a peace deal between the Israelis and Palestinians later that same decade, when he famously visited the town of Ramallah in the West Bank and met with a senior member of Hamas, to the anger of Israel.
But I'm not a negotiator. I'm just trying to understand different opinions and provide communications between people that won't communicate with each other.
He would show that same determination when he was later diagnosed with liver cancer in 2015.
Yeah, there was a lot of healthcare initiatives the Carter Center worked on. There was also a lot of like global diplomacy initiatives that they worked on as well. It's like one of the, like I said, it's it's shocking to see that a former president started a think tank that actually was like center left in American foreign policy. That's like unique. Okay.
Spread to his brain.
I just thought I had a few weeks left.
Miraculously, he recovered and, despite old age, continued to tirelessly pursue his projects, building homes for the underprivileged, even as his own fragility began to show. Taking a tumble in 2019, he still refused to slow down. But without doubt, one of Carter's most enduring legacies will be the partnership he shared with his beloved wife.
Hamas, I don't think they existed at the time. I don't know what part they were talking about, but yes, Hamas certainly didn't exist at the time. But he did. I'm pretty sure the Carter, the Carter Center monitored the 2007 elections, as they've monitored every Venezuelan election as well.
Rosalind, to whom he was married for 77 years.
So I think they were talking about the extremist terrorists within the PLO. Remember, suspiciously, every Palestinian group that is tasked with Palestinian emancipation, whether they are negotiating with Israel or not negotiating with Israel, is a terrorist. There's actually a really good Palestine legal convo between Palestine Legal's own Dylan Saba and Brace Belden and Liz Franzak of the True and Not podcast, where they talk about the terrorism designation and its first application in American history. And it was first utilized, this vague terminology was first applied to the PLO and has consistently been used against every Palestinian liberation organization. Palestinian Liberation Group. So Lolo blocked me on TikTok because I kept calling him out on isolationist talking points. Okay, take a week off and really reconsider why you think I would be I would do anything against that. It's like, yeah, hey, what's up, guys? I'm annoying. They were actually Hamas. It was 2008. Yeah, if they're talking about 2008, then it is Hamas. But if they're talking about when Carter was in charge, then yeah, it's not. And trust me, that Hamas didn't really exist back then. It was basically an Islamic charity. Carter paused aid for the El Salvador military that abducted, raped, and killed 3 U.S. nuns for a brief moment, then continued giving aid. White people said he wrote a book and a house. Yes, chatter. Don't worry, we're gonna get to that. I'm gearing up for that side, the dark side, the side that isn't often covered.
So important was she to Carter that Rosalind was often invited to cabinet meetings during their years in the White House. And when she passed away in 2023, then 99-year-old Carter attended the memorial service despite
Alta Salty Baba, thank you for the 5 tier 1, give the subs.
Having been placed in hospice care himself earlier in the year. He was determined to be there.
By the way, okay, there's 2 things I learned that I didn't know about Carter since his passing. Number 1, Yasser Arafat tried to warn Carter that their Republicans were like the Reagan campaign was actually trying to get the PLO to open up back channel communications with Iran to sidestep Carter's administration and extend the refugee crisis in an effort to use it as the hostage crisis in an effort to use it as a weapon against Carter. And Jimmy Carter literally threw his hands up in the air and said, I don't care. Don't tell me about any of this. That's one thing I learned. And the other thing I heard, and I don't know the veracity of the second one, but the other thing I learned was that and this one is even crazier. Apparently Jimmy Carter was not allowed to speak at Obama's inauguration, which is unique. Okay. And the reason for why, hold on, was apparently he wanted to, like, he was at the inauguration, but he was not, was it at the DNC? Oh, this right here. There was less overt tension between Mr. Carter and Mr. Obama, but little warmth either. The former president was annoyed at being left off the program of live speakers at Mr. Obama's nominating convention in 2008, but supported the younger man's efforts to expand health care for the indigent at home while criticizing the continued use of drone strikes that target terrorists overseas. This is a long write-up describing how Jimmy Carter's post-presidency work often conflicted with the agenda of the U.S. government, and there isn't a single mention of Palestine, not one. Why didn't Jimmy Carter, according to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, why didn't Jimmy Carter speak from the podium at the Democratic National Convention? Alan Dershowitz said he had something to do with it. An interview with Shalom TV, the Harvard law professor, says he pushed Barack Obama very hard to make that decision. Dershowitz said in an interview with Shalom TV, Barack Obama had to make a choice between his Jewish supporters and his anti-Israel supporters like Jimmy Carter, and he did not choose Jimmy Carter. And that was an embarrassment for Jimmy Carter and a show of disrespect. It was a good decision, a wise decision, a moral decision, Dershowitz added. Now, I'll say this. Alan Dershowitz is a notorious plagiarizer and a fabulist. Therefore, I don't know if he's just kind of planting himself into the story by lying to Shalom TV. Having said that, however, he did have access and was regarded as a person of worth, a person of decent notoriety that was a member of the elites at the time, and therefore he could have easily had Obama's ear. So I don't know like I said, this claim I don't know the veracity of, because if the only proof of this is the fact that Jimmy Carter was not allowed to speak at Obama's nominating convention, or and the fact that Alan Dershowitz himself said it, okay, I will, it could be fake. It could be him lying to create a story around how much more access and power he actually had, how much more influence he had within the Obama administration. Now, I mean, he is a serial liar, is what I mean. Okay, he's a serial liar, Jeffrey Epstein's bestie. So take this information with a grain of salt, even though it is kind of funny. However, I will say it is unique how much mainstream outlets have erased Jimmy Carter's post-presidential work in terms of the books that he wrote about Israel, for example. Learned this about Carter today. One of the promises you made in 1976 was if you were elected, you would look into reports from Roswell and see if there would be any cover-ups. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. CIA came and contacted a woman. Oh, God, stop. It's like it's the most boring part of every fucking palace intrigue story is like alien shit. Some of you guys literally need lobotomies, man. I swear to fucking Christ. Like, I'm over here talking about covert operations that the CIA is actively engaged in terms of like destabilizing the entire planet that led to like sometimes millions of people being fucking ruthlessly slaughtered in the hands of our allies that we offered fucking material support to. And you go, what about aliens though? But Jimmy Carter and aliens, like, shut the fuck up. God damn, dude. It's just like, I feel like it's a unique way for all of the conspiratorial minded people to just like shift the attention away from real vectors of pain to like some fucking dumbass shit. God damn, dude. This shit pisses me off so much. Anyway, I really do need to take a fucking day or two off. Holy moly. Just eyes on the prize, man. Eyes on the fucking prize. Jesus Christ. Eyes on what, like, actually, like, you just don't give a fuck about anything. Like, you don't care about anything. You just care about, like, the conspiracy theories and the fucking grand narrative of it all. You don't care about like the actual fucking conspiracies that lead to like real people dying, okay? Don't you have spas in LA? No. They do, but
for her till the end, describing Rosalind as my equal partner in everything I ever accomplished. As long as Rosalind was in the world, I always knew somebody loved and supported.
It's a fucking funny clip of a story. Good Lord, man, take a deep breath. No, it's just like I see it. I treat it as like a distraction in these issues. Okay, in these situations when we're talking about like real shit, real tangible harm done to people. People that go back and go like, well, what about this alien story? It's just like fucking lasers my brain. I consider it to be sometimes a deliberate distraction. Maybe not in this case, but it's like very frustrating. And then people always like get mad at me for sidestepping away from the important conversation. It's like it's inconsequential, it's insignificant. Okay, I just don't care. Like, unless aliens are coming down to institute a socialist revolution globally, I don't give a shit. Okay.
Me.
So wonderful to see both of you. Thank you for talking.
In an interview to mark their 75th wedding anniversary,
Carter
pee. Was asked what he was most proud of, and notably spoke for both of them when he answered.
Well, we're very proud of having been elected and having served as president. That's the epitome of our lives, I think. I would say that we did what we pledged to do in the campaign. We kept the peace, and we obeyed the law, and we told the truth, and we honored human rights. Those were the things that were important to me.
Mr. President, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what do you want your legacy to be?
When Jimmy Carter was sworn in as the President of the United States in 1977, the nation was still reeling from a period of political upheaval.
I came along at a time when Americans still remembered painfully the lies told and the debacle of Watergate. I was outside Washington. I was not stigmatized by the mistakes that had been made in those previous years.
It's a long way from Plains, Georgia to Washington, D.C.
And I brought a fresh face of a peanut farmer, a working man who swore never to tell a lie or make a misleading statement.
Jimmy Carter from Georgia. I hope to be your next president.
The president and his family surprise and delight everyone by walking the parade route down Pennsylvania Avenue up to the presidential reviewing stand in front of the White House.
But winning the White House at the height of the Cold War carried extraordinary responsibility.
The system is survivable, it's verifiable.
The peanut farmer from Plains suddenly had his finger on the button to start World War III.
It's a horrifying thought. If the Soviets launched a missile attack from Soviet territory, we had 26 minutes before the missile struck New York or Washington or whatever for me to respond. And so I knew that I would have to respond, which may have resulted in a Holocaust. So I went out of my way to understand the problems of Brezhnev. I used to sit by a globe and turn it to Moscow and try to imagine how it looked out on the rest of the world with a formidable military force in NATO and tremendous challenge from China. And what would happen if the Soviets became convinced that they were in danger. Well, I tried to avoid all that, but it was a very terrible responsibility.
To give our own and our nation's security.
Carter took pains to keep the peace and to broker a nuclear arms deal. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, he rolled out a covert mission to arm Afghan resistance fighters and announced a boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games in
That's interesting. I see why you say he seems like a genuinely empathetic person. No, he's like a real fucking Christian, dude. He is. Like, this is pre-Reagan Operation Cyclone, pre-Operation Cyclone, pre-official. It's the start of the brave Mujahideen, okay? Just so you understand. And it's like a lesser known aspect of the Carter administration. It's not often talked about. I mean, foreign policy in general is just like often not talked about at all, right? Unless it's a way to justify why American intervention was a necessity.
In Moscow.
With Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
The goal, he says, was to pressure the Soviets to reform.
I wanted to change their system of government, but I also wanted to bring the Soviet Union into the international forum. The Soviet Union, had in effect promised to honor human rights, and they had failed. But over a period of time, I think that may or may not have had an impact on Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah, I mean, look, here, we'll cover this a little bit, but when former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski bragged about prompting the Soviet Union to invade Afghanistan so that it could get its Vietnam, he was not making an empty boast. Afghanistan was the ground for one of the last Cold War battles between the United States and the Soviet Union after the Red Army rolled into the country on December 24th, 1979. For the next decade, the Soviet Union became bogged down in a guerrilla war against anti-Soviet Mujahideen. Faced with a rugged mountainous terrain and stiff resistance, the supposedly invincible Red Army was humbled, leading, according to some experts, to the empire's collapse. And it certainly did, okay? The Soviet involvement in Afghanistan absolutely played a formative role in the collapse of the USSR, okay? And many years after the fact, Brzezinski openly, before 9/11, openly touted his foreign policy bona fides and said that this was a deliberate attempt to radicalize a lot of the otherwise nascent movements of the Mujahideen on the ground in an effort to destabilize the USSR adjacent Afghan government, forcing the USSR's hand into direct involvement, turning Afghanistan into the USSR's own Vietnam. Those were his words. Observers give a number of reasons for the Soviet invasion. Until 1973, Afghanistan was a monarchy led by King Mohammad Zahir Shah before he was overthrown by his cousin Mohammed Daoud, whose party consisted of pro-communist elements. Daoud was overthrown by the Afghan communists. Internal struggles among the communists led to another coup in which Hafizullah Amin took the reins of power. According to experts, the Soviets perceived Amin as a potential Tito. He was in touch with both China and the United States, and the Soviets saw Afghanistan slipping out of its orbit. According to former CIA Director Robert Gates, U.S. intelligence services began aiding the anti-Soviet Union Mujahideen 6 months ahead of the Red Army's invasion. Brzezinski said he convinced Carter to sign the first directive for secret aid to opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul on July 3, 1979, in an effort to goad the Red Army into invading in a 1998 interview. Obviously, we have the hindsight of 2020, but most of the Mujahideen became reactionary Islamist Taliban. But was Carter supposed to just be silent when the Soviet Union committed a genocide? More people died in the Soviet invasion than the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Wait, what? This is before. What are you talking about? About 2/3 of the Afghan population was displaced or killed. No, you're not wrong. It was fucking brutal. But you have to understand that this is before this happened. You understand that, right? Like, this is before the USSR invasion. What are you? I don't understand how you don't get that. I'm talking about the Soviet-Afghan war. There were more internally, externally displaced and killed than both U.S. interventions. Okay, but we're not talking about. I'm confused. Have you already covered this 1800 stuff? Yes. I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention, said Brzezinski. The former National Security Advisor's plan was a success. The Afghan quagmire forced the Soviet Union to stay in the Central Asian state for a decade. The initial thrust of the Soviet invasion was made by some 40,000 troops. By late 1985, this number swelled to 118,000, of which 10,000 were reported to be in the Soviet secret police and other special units to try to face down the Afghan resistance. 2 days after the Soviet invasion, Brzezinski sent a memo to the U.S. president expressing concern that if the Soviets succeed in Afghanistan, the age-long dream of Moscow to have direct access to the Indian Ocean will have been fulfilled. Virtually every intervention that happened in the Cold War era, from Afghanistan to Korea, in the post-World War II Cold War era, all the way until the dissolution of the USSR, virtually every single foreign intervention that America conducted was done in incredibly violent ways to directly destabilize these nations and punish them for the crime of having Soviet sympathies. Okay? In many circumstances, the people that were killed in this process, sometimes due to the incompetence of the Soviet-aligned governments, and incompetence born out of the fears of being destabilized, and oftentimes, more frequently than that, the direct violence of the American-aligned puppet states that were beefed up and defended by, sometimes, like in the case of Korea, direct American military action. Okay, has led to countless instances of straightforward, not ethnic cleansing, but at least like ideologically cleansing the population. If you look at places like Indonesia, The numbers are in not even the tens of thousands, not even the hundreds of thousands, but almost a million. I think more than a million, as a matter of fact. And in Korea, it's tens of thousands before the Korean War. So these guys, like the things that the American aligned governments did are endlessly inhumane. And the reasons as to why they did it was because they did not want, no matter what, they did not want any sort of USSR involvement, any sort of soft power initiatives that still are in place in the new Cold War that we're currently experiencing against China. Now, you can look at that situation and be like, well, look at the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, which is true. That is something worthy of much criticism, right? Oh, they're implementing a cultural genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. How dare you refuse to reckon with that reality? Okay? I do not hide that. I do not, act like that's not a real thing that's happening. I have talked about this many times over. Having said that, however, like, think about that within the context of what is also ongoing with our foreign allies, an extension of the United States of American empire, Israel, and what Israel is doing in Gaza. Okay? But Harrison said the Soviet Union was never scheming towards the Indian Ocean, adding Brzezinski promoted confrontation between Washington and Moscow in the Afghan arena. Brzezinski's hardline policy towards the Soviet Union was reflected in his policy towards Afghanistan. Over the 10 years, the CIA pumped some $2 billion of aid, weapons, and logistical support to the Mujahideen, who fervently believed they were fighting a jihad. Washington was using resistance groups for its own anti-Soviet purposes, said Selig Harrison, South Asia expert at Washington-based Center for International Policy. Brzezinski knew that a communist country's invasion of a Muslim state would raise the hackles of the Muslim world. In a memo to former President Carter, the National Security Advisor said, Muslim countries will be concerned and we might be in a position to exploit this. Yeah, this is Mika Brzezinski's father, by the way, ironically, for those of you who do not know. Morning Joe, Mika, that's who this man is. The Mujahideen put up fierce resistance. They employed guerrilla tactics against the Soviets by launching successful raids before disappearing into the numerous caves tucked into Afghanistan's many mountains. The majority of aid from Washington went to the faction led by strongman Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan Robert Newman described as an extremist and a very violent man. In 1987, the United States provided handheld Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the resistance fighters. With these deadly missiles, the Mujahideen shot down Soviet planes and helicopters daily. Following the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, some elements of the Mujahideen evolved into groups Washington today includes in its so-called war against terror, including the Taliban. The blowback effect is quite far-flung, said Harrison. We still have Stinger missiles turning up in strange places, he added. While it seemed like a good idea at the time to provide Mujahideen with CIA training, funding, equipment, Afghanistan evolved into a breeding ground for Islamist groups, which had little love for the U.S. either. Most prominent figure to rise from Afghanistan is Osama bin Laden, leader of the Al-Qaeda group, accused by Washington of masterminding the September 11th attacks in New York and Washington. The CIA followed a myopic, short-sighted policy in Afghanistan by focusing its energies on only trying to make it hot for the Soviets and disregarding the agendas of groups it supported, said Harrison. These groups were using CIA aid to fight the Soviets to prepare for the day to fight the United States, he said. When asked if he regretted supporting these factions to fight the Soviets, Brzezinski replied, and this is in 1998, by the way, an interview that he gave boasting about his involvement, goading the USSR to invade Afghanistan because it would lead inevitably to its own version of Vietnam. He said, pre 9/11, he said, what's more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? A statement that would haunt him, even though, of course, not many people bring this up, with the exception of the likes of people like myself and maybe the Blowback podcast. But for those who know, this was damning for Brzezinski, considering that he very openly showed the short-sighted nature of American intervention, overlooking the concept of blowback. From the onset of the invasion, the United States had no genuine concerns for the problems of the Central Asian state, said Harrison. When Washington was satisfied it had beaten the Soviets, it turned its back on Afghanistan and allowed the country to slide into turmoil. I won't say what current Eastern European nation is experiencing similarities. This time, there is no ideological component associated with it, and it's a pure irredentist versus imperialist battle. Okay? I just won't say anything. So, is it really short-sighted policy if you know you can use blowback as a consent manufacturing for future interventions? It is short-sighted policy if you personally think you can evade a blowback and at least like shelter Americans domestically from the potential consequences, or at least greatly limit those consequences. Because 3,000 dead Americans in the heart of empire is still a striking blow. Okay? Like, taking advantage of that chaos is one thing, which, of course, the American government did. But it's short-sighted because no government, no competent government, no fucking real, no real government wants their own citizens to get this devastating fucking blow. Bold of you to think the imperial oligarchs care about dead civilians that aren't their own immediate family. Anyway, here's from Mondo Weiss, Jimmy Carter's Palestine legacy. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who died on Sunday at the age of 100, is a man whose legacy will be forever inextricably linked to Israel and Palestine. Yet that legacy will be built as much on myth as on reality, with so many other aspects of his history and the politics of the, in air quotes, Holy Land. Carter is remembered fondly by many on the left, and for good reason. In many areas, he tried to govern with humanity, decency, and with regard to people's rights. Counterpunch wrote a Jimmy Carter, the False Savior article, which I think is probably pretty good as well. He was not always successful, as citizens of Cambodia and East Timor can attest. Still, if he was far from perfect, Carter did still bring principles of human rights into his policy thinking more than any other U.S. president in living memory, and quite possibly in all of American history. Is he part of why you hate Poland? What? No. There can be little doubt that Carter's heart was in the right place when it came to his ambition to resolve what he referred to as the Israel-Palestine conflict. Carter spoke often about the need for Palestinian rights to be recognized, but he also repeatedly noted that he was motivated by his affection for Israel and his desire to see it survive, something he did not believe it could do if it continued to oppress the Palestinians. Now, I need you guys to understand something. When we talk about American intervention in the region, specifically this resource-rich region that has been constantly undermined by Western powers all the way back with colonies and then further destabilized by American intervention, if you consistently find yourself wondering, why the fuck are so many of these countries run by guys who are fundamentalists, run by guys who are declared radicals, run by guys who have a real hatred for the United States of America? Where is that hatred born out of? Why are these people so in your opinion, backwards. American intervention plays a very big role in this process, all the way from the Iranian Revolution down to the Taliban control of Afghanistan. And it is a story that repeats itself time and time again. Okay? Western powers have consistently seen fundamentalist interpretations of Islam, from Wahhabists all the way to the modern Salafist movements that now even control Syria as well, which has been fine for the time being in the interim period so far, okay, as a successful counterbalance against the much more damaging and the much scarier version of events, which would be secular socialist movements that declare natural resources to belong to the people, movements that actually harm corporate interests, foreign interests in these nations. You prop these guys up and you think, well, we're allies, we're aligned right now. We are aligned against the scary Soviet intervention, the scary socialist attitudes that people have. I'm broadly a USSR sympathizer, but the Afghan war was just reprehensible. Dude, I'm not defending the USSR intervention in Afghanistan. What don't you understand? Yes, it was an unimaginably bloody affair. What are you talking about? Unbelievable bloodshed, and they even toppled the existing secular socialist regime in Afghanistan. Also, the secular socialist regime in Afghanistan was fucking butchering the Muslims too. It's not like the secular socialist regime in Afghanistan was doing great things either. Okay? They were murking people in mosques and shit. Like, what are you talking about? They were clearing out villages. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I place way more blame on the cultivation of reactionary sentiments / the Taliban to the USSR as opposed to just U.S. funding. Blowback is very real, but what would you have done if you were in a position of power? Okay. My point, couldn't one say the decision by U.S. to intervene in Afghanistan eventually led to 9/11? Yes, that is what I say. I say that all the time. That is what many scholars also say. It's called blowback. That is what this is. It's one of the greatest examples of blowback because it's one of the few instances where blowback actually came back to the heart of empire. Oftentimes, blowback comes in the form of the Iranian Revolution, right? You undermine and overthrow the democratically elected social democratic regime, right? And you put forth a monarch that is brutal and bloody. And inevitably, the people say, fuck you. And the groups that come out of that, successfully, that end up toppling that Shah regime, are sometimes more radical elements, more fundamentalist elements. Okay? That is the story of Iran. But if we are to talk about Afghanistan, yeah, there is an inevitability there. If you fund fundamentalist groups because they're anti-Soviet and, you still consistently intervene in the affairs of the region, inevitably the guns and the training that you gave them will be turned on you. Is your opinion based entirely on hindsight? I like that an accurate interpretation of American intervention in the Middle East and a retelling of events is considered hindsight. Yeah, of course it's hindsight. The fuck are you talking about? Yeah, dude, it's called learning history, which is what we're doing right now in this moment. Like what? Learning about historical events that led to fundamentalist groups seizing power in many different countries, okay, is one thing. Applying that understanding of interventionist policies and that end up damaging both the nation state that you are dealing with and destabilizing, and even sometimes having that harm come back domestically and harming the domestic population and applying that to modern day events is just foresight. It turns into hindsight, turns into foresight in that regard. You know, history does not repeat, but it often rhymes, as the classic take, right? That's kind of the reason why we learn about these things, I think, with the hopes that we don't repeat those mistakes of the past. In terms of like, you just called Monday morning quarterback for talking about history. I know. Now, in terms of like, well, what was Carter supposed to do? He's just a little baby. Do you think that Carter's administration was the first time America had engaged in this kind of intervention? Do you forget that the president prior had already done a whole bunch of this stuff as well? It's like saying, what is Biden supposed to do? What is Biden supposed to do? I don't understand. He's just a little baby. Okay, well, maybe he can read some fucking history. Okay? Do you understand? Perhaps, instead of saying, what was Carter supposed to do, which is a rinse and repeat of, well, what is Clinton supposed to do? What is George W. Bush supposed to do? What is Obama supposed to do? What is Biden supposed to do? What is Trump supposed to do? You know, recognize that if you have the capacity to understand American intervention and its damaging consequences, both on foreign soil and also how those damaging consequences can impact the entire globe, especially as we're past the point of 2 decades on America's war on terror, right? Something that even the broadest majorities of the American domestic population understand was a massive fucking failure and destabilized the entire globe, not just that region, but destabilized Europe and destabilized America as well. Implemented a surveillance state, basically openly legitimized a surveillance state that was already in existence. We can just look at these events and go, maybe these aren't mistakes. Maybe these are deliberate attempts. If you can comprehend this, so neutralizing the USSR at the moment wasn't the right action? Fuck no. Fuck no, it wasn't the right action. What are we talking about? Of course it wasn't the right action. What? Like, Stalin's domestic mistakes aside, okay? His initial attempts at normalizing relations with the West was immediately cast aside time and time and time again. Okay? What are we talking about? Like, this is circa Carter, obviously. We're now talking about post-World War II American intervention at a time when the USSR has incurred tremendous penalties for successfully ridding the world of the Nazi scourge. 20 million plus dead. Many 18 to 35-year-old men, but also women and children as well in the process. And America, which was relatively unscathed in comparison to the entirety of Europe and all of the other areas that were impacted tremendously worse by World War II, was able to take advantage of that situation and immediately work to counter what they perceived is the greater threat, a much larger threat than Nazi Germany. The rise of ideological commitments to the people that worked to liberate the world of Nazi violence, of fascist violence. It was always a far bigger threat Carter had and often expressed boundless sympathy for the Jewish people and what they had endured throughout history, but he recognized both that this history did not justify the oppression of another people and that establishing an ethnocentric apartheid state would not end the scourge of anti-Semitism or the harm that caused the Jews. This was the ethos he expressed in his book, even while it was less visible in his policies as president. Carter's view of the issue was inevitably shaped by his evangelical Christian background. This is also written about extensively. Like, his original interpretation of the situation was like, oh, it's the Holy Land. I don't know anything about this, but I just know that it's like a holy land. I'll tell you this much, by the way. Going back to the Red Scare and the war against the Soviet Union, okay? Many Europeans that are in this chat feel a certain way about the USSR historically, and many Americans do as well. There's this underlying resentment, tremendous amount of resentment, okay? Oftentimes, it's not for the internal affairs of the USSR, but what they've learned in history books from, obviously, the Red Scare era remnants of anti-socialist sentiment. What they fail to recognize is that that sentiment is carried over in American politics in tremendously damaging ways, okay? Nixon famously ran on anti-communist sentiment, where he said, and this is from Blowback Season 3, the welfare state, social safety nets, or straightforward communism, these are all the same. So if you're wondering as an American, why don't we have health care in this country? Why is there such a why does for-profit healthcare insurance companies devastate the American population in broad fucking daylight with seemingly no intervention or no government action taken against them? Okay? Part of that is because of the undying loyalty that Americans have to defending anti-socialist sentiment. Okay? That's it. That's it. So it has a capacity to harm you directly while you are still advocating for your own demise in this way. It's an interesting dynamic, but I hope people can understand it. Anyway, let's continue. Carter's view on Israel was inevitably shaped by his evangelical Christian background and his thorough immersion in the view of Israel that dominated the United States through the Cold War after World War II. It was a view that few Palestinians would recognize, but it was also a view that in the 1970s and 1980s was still more critical of Israeli actions than the overwhelming majority of Americans. Carter's view evolved over the years, as we can see from two major points of Carter's engagement with the issue: the Camp David Agreement and Israel-Egypt Peace Treaty of 1978 and 1979, respectively, and the publication of his controversial book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, in 2006. I had the privilege of meeting Carter, says the Monowise writer, a few years before his book was published. The meeting was attended by about half a dozen progressive leaders in the San Francisco Bay Area. The most striking thing I recall, aside from the oppressive feeling his Secret Service guards projected, was the depth of his feeling when we talked about both Jewish history and the Palestinian present at that time. I've met many political leaders, and I'm used to the air of phoniness they project. There was none of that with Carter. If he wasn't genuinely affected by the suffering he was talking about, he was a much better actor than he ever was a politician. This is why I said I think he is a genuinely decent person who did, as the leader of empire, unimaginably indecent things. Okay? That's why he is one of the more unique presidents. Because most presidents are fucking awful demons, both in their time in office and also certainly awful demons post-presidency. Okay? They don't even have they don't even do the bare minimum of trying to clear up some of the mismanagement that they engaged in, the deliberate death and destruction that they pushed for. EU has this context, yet they don't like the USSR. Why? For example, EU countries make fun of us for non-socialized healthcare, etc. So what's their reason for hating the USSR? Is the EU just full of Nazis? I would say that this is an entire, virtually a century of anti-socialist and anti-communist propaganda in a similar vein, both within the EU as well as the United States of America, oftentimes backed by the United States of America. What do you think? In the immediate aftermath of World War II, when French people were asked who was most responsible for liberating Europe from Nazis, the overwhelming majority said that it was the USSR. I believe in 2002 or 2012, there was a similar study conducted. The overwhelming majority said it was America that liberated Europe from the Nazis. How do you think that happened? Here's the poll. Americans, French, and Germans give America credit for Nazism's defeat. It was early 2000s, I believe, after decades of American World War II propaganda. Yeah. France has changed its tune on American and Russians in World War II. Who do you think played the most important role in defeating the Nazis during World War II? 57% in 1945 said the Russians, the USSR. In 2018, 56% say it was the Americans, and only 15% say the USSR. So how did that happen? How? Soft power, Marshall Plan, NATO, Operation Gladio, and the bounties of the complete and utter defeat of the Soviets in the aftermath of the Cold War. And the propaganda that played a formative role in justifying the American position, the capitalist position. Because this isn't just about America, this is about global capitalism. Here is what is known as the Truman Doctrine. In this tense international atmosphere, U.S. President Harry S. Truman broke with the policy of his predecessor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and redefined the country's foreign policy guidelines. On the 12th of March, 1947, in a speech to the U.S. Congress, the president presented his doctrine of containment, which aimed to provide financial and military aid to the countries threatened by Soviet expansion. Clearly aimed at stopping the spread of communism, the Truman Doctrine positioned the United States as the defender of a free world in the face of Soviet aggression. An aid package of around $400 million was granted to Greece and Turkey. This new doctrine provided a legitimate basis for the United States activism during the Cold War. Applying the doctrine of containment, the Americans encouraged Turkey to resist Soviet claims to rights over naval bases in the Bosphorus. They also secured the withdrawal of Russian troops from Iran. In the meantime, since March 1947, efforts to crack down on Soviet espionage had been coordinated, and the United States set up its Central Intelligence Agency. These changes to external policy marked a real turnaround in the history of the United States, which had previously remained on the sidelines of European disputes. For the U.S., isolationism was no longer an option. If you are geopolitically positioned away from the greater violence that the civilian population was subjected to during World War II, and you now had an economic engine that was supercharged within the war economy, you could take advantage of the destabilization to continue the ideological capitalist domination around the globe. I agree the USSR lost 25 million to defeat fascism, and the US did all they could to thwart the admirable Soviet mission to spread global socialism, but we can't just infantilize a superpower, and the majority of U.S. funding of Mujahideen was after the USSR invasion. 1.3 million killed and 7 million displaced out of a population of 12 million. Do we just remain silent when the USSR was committing a genocide? No, but I don't think you understand. One, I'm not saying, I've never, ever said that the USSR invasion of Afghanistan was good, okay? I'm talking about how we arrive at that position. I don't know why you fail to comprehend that. I don't know why you think this is like some secret apologia that I'm engaging in. It was bad for multiple reasons, okay? First and foremost, the death and devastation of the civilian population, the displacement and the destabilization that took place. There is no infantilization there at all. It also led to the end of the USSR. I don't know. I don't know why you keep repeating this over and over again. Yes, it is a massive failure on all fronts. I don't think it's that. It's just that I don't know what I would have done if I was in a position of power. Okay. Well, if you can place yourself in the mind of Carter and the Carter administration, okay, you can maybe place yourself in the mind of the USSR as well. Like, oh, what do you do? What kind of intervention do you engage in? This kind of thought experiment allows you to literally justify, and being anti-Soviet was objectively a good thing in that specific conflict, in my opinion. This kind of opinion will cause you to end up defending the actions of either government. I'm not doing that at all. Anyway, going back to Carter, though, because we're jumping on a bunch of different talking points here. Carter spoke with pride of the work he put in with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to the agreement at Camp David, with the immense regret that he didn't do more to secure a better future for the Palestinian people. One can debate the politics and strategy of his actions and even find considerable fault with them, but it is clear that his intentions towards both people were positive. Carter was seen by much of the Jewish community and many other supporters of Israel as an enemy, the man who forced the then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to accept compromises that he and the pro-Israel community wished to reject. But as it played out, Carter did more for Israel's security than any other U.S. president, while unwittingly setting the stage for the steady erosion of Palestinian rights that the Oslo process represented. The result of the Camp David summit and the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement that emerged from it was that Israel has not faced a credible military threat since the agreement was put in place. Carter understood, as any observer would, that if Israel made peace with Egypt, it would remove the single biggest military challenger in the region, and the remaining Arab states would no longer be able to mount a credible threat against Israel. He understood as well that by bringing Egypt firmly into the United States' sphere of influence, the Cold War balance of power in the Middle East shifted significantly. Carter, in that case, acted not only in the interests of Israel, but also to clear American interests in the outcome. The regime of annual aid that has flowed ever since to both Israel and Egypt locked both countries into an alliance and into a certain degree of dependence on the U.S., a factor that was of great importance in Cold War strategy. All of this was lost on Israel supporters in the United States. In his book, We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel, historian Eric Alterman described the reaction to Carter mentioning the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, citing Carter's press secretary Jody Powell describing the reaction as bonkers. Alterman elaborated. Democratic fundraising events were canceled. Representatives of the administration of Jewish groups were shunned. Hyman Bookbinder, the outspokenly liberal Washington representative of the American Jewish community, lectured the Carter people. Obviously, you do not really understand what these words mean. Palestinian rights means the destruction of Israel. A Harris poll taken at the time found 60% of Jews agreeing with the statement that the president and his people have abandoned Israel. A statement that you have heard time and time again, as a matter of fact. Obviously, you apparently do not really understand what these words mean. Palestinian rights are at direct odds with the rights of the Israeli public. Palestinian rights is a substitute for the death and destruction of the nation state of Israel. You understand? Alterman further noted that the chairman of the Conference of Presidents' major Jewish organizations at the time, Alexander Schindler, leaked the contents of a private meeting with Carter to the press, a highly unusual betrayal of trust. That generated even more intense controversy and American Jewish anger at Carter, as it was intended to do. All of this, it must be noted, was in response to Carter's vision of Palestine being a sort of autonomous adjunct of Jordan, a position not far removed from that of most of the Israeli political spectrum. He was not advocating for an independent Palestinian state, an idea which was completely out of bounds in American political discourse in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Indeed, Carter in March 1977 said, the first prerequisite of a lasting peace is the recognition of Israel by her neighbors. Israel's right to exist, Israel's right to exist permanently. Carter never wavered from that position, despite the invective hurled at him by Israelis and Israel's American boosters for the rest of his life. When the historic agreement emerged from Camp David, parts of the Jewish community saw Carter in a better light. But this soon faded amid controversy over the sale of fighter jets to Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Jewish leadership got even more enraged when, due to a miscommunication, the U.S. voted in favor of a Security Council resolution that condemned Israeli settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Though Carter said that the U.S. was supposed to abstain and only voted yes by mistake, which marks one of the few instances where the American government officially sided against Israel, a mistake that they never repeated, mind you. It was quite controversial. I need to add so I remember to sub. Okay. Here's your reminder. At the top of the hour, we no longer run ads, but you should be reminded right now to subscribe, which you can do for $6 or for free with a Twitch Prime. Twitch Prime is free. You can also get gifted a sub. When you subscribe, you support the broadcast and the many initiatives that I engage with, but also maintain my editorial independence, and you can send me links. It's completely voluntary. If you don't feel the need to do so, you don't have to, but just a reminder. General Justinian, thank you for the 5 gifted subs. Baja Blast My Brains Out, thank you for the 10. Virtual Meal, thank you for the 10 gifted subs as well. Wrong. They are discounted, chat, at $4.50 right now. NDK, thank you for the 5. And throwing bagels at the wall, thank you for the 10 community gifted subs. Though Carter said the U.S. was supposed to abstain and only voted yes by mistake, the Jewish leadership already hostile to him was not mollified. It was worth noting, however, that at the time, opposition to settlements was much stronger U.S. policy. So much so that even the staunchest pro-Israel advocates didn't expect the U.S. to vote no on the resolution. Times have certainly changed. While the Jewish community was nowhere near large or powerful enough to cause the defeat of an incumbent president, it was a factor in Edward Kennedy's strong, if ultimately unsuccessful, challenge for the Democratic nomination in 1980, which weakened Carter. Carter had the poorest showing among Jews any Democratic presidential candidate had since 1920. Although he still won the plurality of the vote, John Anderson, who ran as an independent, got 15% of the Jewish vote, the Carter's 45%, and Ronald Reagan's 39%. Yet after all of that, and with some continued grumbling and foot stomping, Israel did manage to make peace with Egypt, withdraw its settlements from the Sinai Peninsula, secure the annual funding that has stabilized and grown its economy, and helped it become the dominant military power in the region, and kept Egypt as a cold ally ever since. Israel has Jimmy Carter to thank for all of that. So while many people talk about the successful initiatives of Camp David, from the perspective of Palestinian emancipation, it was a major setback, and it completely pacified one of the vectors of pressure against the state of Israel. It also opened up Israel's control over the Suez Canal, or potential control over not just the Red Sea trade ports, but it left it in the hands of an American client state, a state that became an American client state in the aftermath of this. Reagan did little but press forward on Carter's actions until the end of his second term. Ironically, Reagan would, only a few months later after taking office, have his own run-ins with Israel's domestic U.S. lobby over the sale of the airborne warning and control system to Saudi Arabia. Yet Reagan remained beloved among the pro-Israel forces despite selling a state-of-the-art military system to the Saudis, whom Israel was still extremely unfriendly with at that point, despite its frequent criticism of Israel's behavior in Lebanon, and despite rebuking Israel for its dangerous attacks on a Syriac nuclear site in Iraq in 1981. The difference was that Reagan rarely mentioned the Palestinians and often said nice things about Israel. Now, famously, the video of Jimmy Carter talking to journalist Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! In 2007 is a video that has been circulated quite a lot since his untimely demise. In this interview, which we showed earlier, which we showed yesterday, Jimmy Carter said, the word apartheid is exactly accurate. In 2007, he said this. Within Palestinian territory, they are absolutely and totally separated, much worse than they were in South Africa, by the way. And the other thing is, the other definition of apartheid is one side dominates the other, and the Israelis completely dominate the life of the Palestinian people. Carter was responding to the resounding criticism of his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. The book itself was far less remarkable than the title, which drew an avalanche of criticism to Carter, including accusations of anti-Semitism. Then ADL leader Abraham Foxman said, the title is to delegitimize Israel, because if Israel is like South Africa, it doesn't really deserve to be a democratic state. He is provoking, he's outrageous, and he's bigoted. But perhaps most damningly, he was correct. Foxman's statement is bizarre. States, of course, do not deserve to be democratic. It is something that they either are to a significant degree or they are not. Foxman could not even utter the possibility that Israel was not a democratic state, which, interestingly, was certainly not what Carter was saying either in his book or in his subsequent statements and writing. Carter was trying to warn Israel that it would become an apartheid state if it didn't change course. This stood in sharp contrast to the claims of Palestinians who by 2007 had already been accusing Israel of apartheid for many years. Worse for Foxman was that Carter made the argument that legitimate Palestinian views were rarely heard in the media, although Carter neither stated nor even implied that this demonstrable statement of fact had anything to do with the nefarious conspiracy of Jewish control. Foxman said the reason it gives for this, for why he wrote this book is the shameful canard that the Jews control the debate in this country, especially when it comes to the media. Anytime I talk about Israel's influence or involvement in domestic American political affairs, the same exact organizations and the same exact sentiment rears its ugly head. This conflation between Judaism and Israel, this false conflation, has existed in perpetuity. It plays a formative role in legitimizing anti-Semitic, nascent anti-Semitic opinions that people have. And yet, nothing changes. Just something to think about. Carter knew he was going to get hit for the title of his book. The substance, however, made it clear that he was trying to steer Israel away from its own self-immolation. Ironically enough, many Israeli leaders have made similar assessments. As recently as a couple months ago, a former defense minister of Benjamin Netanyahu himself said identical things. Interesting. The bottom line is this: peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when the Israeli government is willing to comply with international law. It will be a tragedy for the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the world if peace is rejected and a system of oppression, apartheid, and sustained violence is permitted to prevail. The woman in Joe Biden's administration who currently and undeservedly holds the position of special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, said Carter's book ignores a legacy of mistreatment, expulsion, and murder committed against Jews. It trivializes the murder of Israelis. Now, facing a storm of criticism, he has relied on anti-Semitic stereotypes in defense. The scurrilous accusation is backed up with the same sleight of hand Foxman used. Carter continued to advocate for Palestinian rights while also, contrary to the assertion Lipstadt and Foxman, repeatedly asserting that Israel must be afforded a secure existence within recognized and clear borders. In November 2016, as Barack Obama was preparing to leave office, Carter urged the outgoing president to recognize the Palestinian state, arguing the combined weight of the United States recognition, UN membership, and a Security Council resolution solidly grounded in international law would lay the foundation for a future diplomacy. These steps would bolster moderate Palestinian leadership while sending a clear assurance to the Israeli public of the worldwide recognition of Israel and its security. It was not the first time he had promoted such recognition. To which Barack Obama responded with, "I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Did you say give $38 billion to Israel? Because that's what I'm going to do instead." And that's precisely what Barack Obama did. A man who was friends with both Rashid Khalidi and Edward Said, mind you. A man who is still considered, Barack Hussein Obama, as the number one Jew hater president in the eyes of many of Israel's staunchest supporters. This was the theme of Carter's efforts from the 1970s to the end of his days. He was willing to take risks to see that vision come true. Over the years, he and the Carter Center, made many efforts to heal the breach between Fatah and Hamas, ignoring criticism over talking with Hamas. Carter's legacy should be scrutinized carefully and honestly with the same critical eye as any other president. He made his mistakes, and as with any president, innocent people suffered as a result. But more than any other U.S. president, Jimmy Carter tried to create a better future for Palestinians and for Israeli Jews. No president before or since has tried as hard or has placed peace ahead of political concerns to the extent that he did, which is why I say Jimmy Carter while in his own personal affairs, in his own personal conduct, in his own personal experience, especially in his post presidential existence, was definitely a man who tried to do right. Having said that, however, we will go back to the many awful things
this is not the
that he did during his tenure. And for that, we must go to the Counterpunch video. And this is only on foreign policy. We've yet to factor in the Jimmy Carter administration bringing about the neoliberal era that will end up destroying contemporary American existence, something that haunts every single one of you in very meaningful and very tangible ways. Anytime you think about why certain things just suck, remember that the devil himself, Ronald 666 Reagan, was probably responsible for it. But it wasn't Ronald Reagan that kickstarted this process. Jimmy Carter also played a formative role in neoliberalism taking root in American society. Counterpunch starts off by talking about having run as a Washington outsider, he immediately filled his administration with trilateral commission members, hoping that a coterie of Rockefeller internationalists could resurrect the confidence of American leaders and enrich business relationships within Japan and the United States. His Secretary of State was Cyrus Vance, a Wall Street lawyer and former planner of the Vietnam slaughter. Secretary of Defense Harold Brown was Lyndon Johnson's Air Force Secretary and a leading proponent of saturation bombing in Vietnam. Secretary of the Treasury Michael Blumenthal was the Standard Rich Corporation president. Attorney General Griffin Bell was a segregationist judge who disclosed that he would request inactive status as a member of Atlanta clubs closed to blacks and Jews. Carter himself stated that housing should be segregated. Energy Coordinator James Schlesinger was a proponent of the winnable nuclear war. Transportation Secretary Brock Adams was a staunch proponent of Lockheed's supersonic transport. National Security Advisor Brzezinski was an anti-Soviet fanatic who said in an interview with The New Yorker that it was egocentric to worry that a nuclear war between the U.S. and the USSR would entail the end of the human race. Sentiments that you hear still to this day. Since it was unlikely that every last human being would perish in such an event, Brzezinski recommended that critics of the U.S. nuclear policy abstain from narcissistic concern for the mere hundreds of millions of people who would. In what William Greider, author of The Secrets of the Temple, a study of the Federal Reserve Bank, called his most important appointment, Carter named Paul Volcker, and this is a very important appointment, to the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. Stuart Eisenstadt, Carter's assistant for the domestic affairs, said that Volcker was selected because he was the candidate of Wall Street. The Wall Street agenda became clear when Volcker contracted the money supply and declared, the standard of living of the average American has to decline. This is a very famous line. Wealth was funneled upward and wages and production declined. Unemployment and bankruptcy rose. Unions shriveled and disappeared. Pentagon spending soared. For the first time ever, American white-collar families couldn't save money. With urban housing costs zooming, workers fled to remote suburbs, but the increased commute expenses tended to cancel out the cheaper mortgages. Moonlighting and overtime work increased, but added income disappeared in and out. Second commutes and higher child care increased. As the cost of necessities outpaced wage gains, only credit cards could fill the widening gap. Hamburger stands and nursing homes proliferated while well-paid manufacturing jobs fled to the third world.